You picture him the second you hear the word. A hunched, grunting brute. Matted hair, a heavy brow, a wooden club dragging through the dirt behind him. He lives in a cold, dark cave, and he is barely smarter than the animals he hunts. Almost everything in that picture is a lie. For more than 100 years, this cartoon has stood in for the truth about your ancestors. The slouching savage, the dim-witted thug, the caveman. But the people who lived through the long stretch of time we flatten into the words Stone Age were not stupid. They were not brutes. And most of them never lived in a cave at all. So where did the lie come from? And who were they really? Start with the word itself. Caveman. It sounds like a plain fact. They lived in caves, so that is where we find them. But archaeologists have a name for the trap hidden inside that logic. They call it preservation bias. It means the past does not survive evenly. A painting or a bone sealed deep inside a limestone cave can last 40,000 years, protected from rain, wind, and rot. The same object left out on an open plain is gone within a few seasons. So caves are simply where the evidence lasted. They are not where most people spent their lives. Your ancestors lived in the open. They built shelters from hides, branches, and bone. At a site called Mezhrich in modern Ukraine, archaeologists uncovered homes built almost entirely from mammoth bones. Hundreds of them, stacked and interlocked into domed huts, roughly 15,000 years ago. That is not the work of a creature too dim to plan. That is engineering. Now look at the brain itself. Here's something that genuinely unsettles people. Measure the skulls of humans from the last ice age, and their brains were, on average, slightly larger than yours is today. Larger, not smaller. The being you imagine as a knuckle-dragging idiot was carrying more raw cranial volume than the person hearing this right now. So if they were not stupid, what were they actually doing with all that time? For most of the 20th century, the assumption was simple. Prehistoric life was a desperate, exhausting grind. Nasty, brutish, and short. Then, in 1963, an anthropologist named Richard Lee went to live with the Jew/Hoansi, a hunter-gatherer people in the Kalahari Desert of southern Africa. He did not guess how they lived. He measured it. He recorded how many hours they actually spent finding food, and the number stunned him. Adults spent only around 15 to 20 hours a week on the work of feeding themselves. The rest of their time went to rest, visiting, storytelling, and play. Let that land for a second. People living in one of the harshest deserts on Earth, with no farms and no supermarkets, were working fewer hours than you probably are right now. The anthropologist James Suzman, who spent decades among the same people, called this idea the original affluent society. Affluent does not mean rich in possessions. It means their needs were modest and easily met. So they had something we are forever chasing and rarely catching. They had enough. And then they had time. But maybe you think they were rich in time and empty in mind. Maybe survival left no room for anything you would call culture. The evidence says the exact opposite. Travel to the south coast of South Africa to a place called Blombos Cave. There, the archaeologist Christopher Henshelwood found pieces of ochre, a soft red stone, carefully engraved with deliberate cross-hatched patterns. They are around 75,000 years old. Nearby, he found beads made from seashells, pierced and worn on a string. Think about what a bead actually is. It has no use. You cannot eat it. It will not keep you warm. A bead exists for one reason only: to mean something, to say, this is who I am. The moment a human strings a bead, you are looking at symbolism, identity, and art, tens of thousands of years before the first city. Then there is the music. In a cave in Germany called Hohle Fels, the archaeologist Nicholas Connard uncovered a flute carved from the wing bone of a vulture with carefully drilled finger holes. It is roughly 40,000 years old, and it still works. Someone deep in the Ice Age sat down and made an instrument, which means someone deep in the Ice Age wanted to hear a song. And the paintings? Walk into Chauvet Cave in southern France, and you will see horses, lions, and rhinos rendered with shading, perspective, and motion, drawn around 36,000 years ago. These are not crude scratches. Trained artists have stood in front of them and wept. Some of these images are so sophisticated that we did not match the technique again for tens of thousands of years. And they all died young, right? Worn out and ancient by 30? That is another piece of the lie. The famous statistic that prehistoric life expectancy was around 30 is real, but it does not mean what you think. It is an average, and it is dragged down by the brutal reality of infant mortality. Many babies died, but a person who survived childhood had a good chance of reaching 60 or 70. The researchers Rachel Kaspari and Sang-Hee Lee studied fossil teeth to count how many individuals lived long enough to become grandparents, and found that in the Upper Paleolithic, that number rose sharply. Your ancestors were not a society of doomed 30-year-olds. They had elders. They had grandparents. They had people who lived long enough to become libraries. So let's reconstruct a single day and let the cartoon fall apart. You wake in a hide shelter, not a cave, as the sky turns gray over the grassland. You are not alone. You live in a band of maybe 20 or 30 people, most of them family. There is no boss, no clock. The morning's work is real, but unhurried. Tracking, gathering, checking. By early afternoon, there is enough food for everyone, and the work is done. The rest of the day is yours. A child wears a necklace of shell beads. An elder, his arm long ago broken and healed crooked, sits by the fire and is fed and listened to, because he carries the maps and the stories no one else remembers. Someone is carving, someone is singing. The fire is the center of everything. That detail about the elder is not a guess. In a cave called Shanidar in the mountains of Iraq, researchers found the skeleton of a Neanderthal man. And yes, Neanderthals belong in this story too. He had survived a crushed eye socket, a withered arm, and serious damage to his leg, all healed long before he died. He could not have hunted. He could not have fended for himself, which means, for years, others fed him, sheltered him, and carried him. The anthropologist Erik Trinkaus, who studied these bones, saw in them something the cartoon insists should not exist: compassion. And that brings us to the most slandered caveman of all, the Neanderthal. The very word has become an insult, a byword for stupid and primitive. So consider this. In several caves in Spain, the scientist Dirk Hoffmann dated red-painted symbols on the walls to around 64,000 years ago. That is thousands of years before your own species, Homo sapiens, even arrived in Europe. The only humans there to paint them were Neanderthals. They made art. They buried their dead. They cared for their weak. And their DNA is still inside most people alive today, because your ancestors did not just meet them. They loved them, had children with them, and carried a piece of them forward into you. Here's the twist no one tells you about the caveman. He did not die out because he was stupid or weak. The image of the doomed, inferior brute is the lie working its hardest. The real story is messier and far more human. A tangle of overlapping peoples, all of them clever, all of them artists, all of them caring for one another, slowly merging until only one branch remained. So why does the false picture survive? Why is the grunting brute so hard to kill? Part of it is comfort. The caveman cartoon lets you believe in a clean, straight climb, from stupid them to brilliant us. It tells a flattering story in which the modern world is the obvious peak of everything. But the evidence does not show a climb. It shows people. People with art, music, medicine, trade, and devotion to one another, living lives that in some ways were richer in time and connection than your own. So look at your own day for a moment. You are likely working longer hours than a Kalahari forager. You may know the faces of fewer people who would carry you if your own arm withered. You wear objects to signal who you are, a brand, a logo, a ring, exactly as a human did 75,000 years ago on a beach in South Africa, threading a shell onto a string. You are not the opposite of the caveman. You are the same animal running older software than you ever realized. So picture him again, the hunched, grunting brute in the cold, dark cave. Look closely. He was never real. He was a story told by people who needed to feel superior to their own grandparents. The truth was standing behind him the whole time, upright, thinking, grieving, decorating, singing, and loving. Everything you know about the caveman is a lie. The real lie was ever believing he was less than you.